Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 19th meeting. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome a great friend of Keele World Affairs in Professor Guy Standing. Those of you who've met him before will know that it's going to be an interesting and challenging ride. It always is with Guy. He has, and those of you who haven't met him before, look forward and fasten your seatbelts. Each time that Guy comes, he has a different theme, but as his biography that we shared with you shows, that I certainly regard him as an outstanding and outspoken critic of 21st century capitalism, and that's based on his life experience of working for the International Labour Organization in Geneva. But he brings a different theme every time. He's banging a different drum, with lots of thoughts and insights. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on his recent book, which is The Politics of Time, Gaining Control in the Age of Uncertainty. So Guy will be at the book desk with Nantwich. If you'd like to go and see him and get a personal signature, please do call in. We are delighted to meet him for the third time. He often goes to Davos to meet the billionaires and plutocrats. He tells me that they haven't invited him for a couple of years. Maybe that he upset them. But we don't have so many zeros at the end of our bank accounts, so I think we will be a more receptive audience to what he has to say tonight. So please welcome again Professor Guy Standing.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. I was worried where it was going at one stage. I was thinking how to start, and in fact, the body of my work has been around a set of connected themes. And in the preface of one of them, I quoted Sir John Gielgud. And John Gielgud made the immodest statement that he is a journeyman. He tries to make it a little better every night. He was being a bit over-modest, but it is something that I feel very attached to, because the work that I've been trying to do is about a set of related themes. And I want to begin this evening by posing a question that I will not answer, at least to start with, which is that what type of work and what type of time use has greater economic value in this country than any other, and yet is given a value of 0 in our measures of national income and economic growth? I'll leave the question, and I'll come back to it if I have time at the end. Let me begin with some good news, too. There are a lot of people saying that we're at the stage of the end of work. You've heard it many times. Technology is going to take over, blah, blah, blah. I believe we're on the cusp of a stage where we are going to see a liberation of work. And if we don't get that liberation, then there is the annihilation of civilization that is rushing towards us, from a place that Bill has asked me not to mention this evening. Now, I want to address 4 themes of the book. The first theme is that every age has had its peculiarities about what is work and what is not work, and has had different ways of looking at how time is divided up. And I find the most enlightened way of conceptualizing time uses in going back to ancient Greece, or in particular to ancient Athens. And the ancient Greeks, particularly Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and the others, divided time into essentially 6 categories. The first was labor. Labor was done by the panosoi, the slaves. It was believed to deform mind and body, and therefore it was unworthy of the citizen to be doing labor. It was a sexist society, a slave-based society, so not a very nice society in those respects. But the concept of labor was alienated activity. And Socrates believed that if you were going to do labor, it was better to be insecure in that labor, because then you were not habituated to accept it as a natural state. Because if you accepted being in labor, it would induce feelings of doulia, servility. Now, they differentiated labor from work. Work was what you did with your friends, your relatives around the home, and it was associated with this beautiful concept of philia, civic friendship. This was a very sharply differentiated way of looking at it. Work was what the citizen wanted to do, and not labor. In addition, they divided 2 other forms of activity. One was recreation. Recreation was what you did to keep your body and mind fit for doing work and doing the next part of time, which was schole or skole, leisure. And skole meant public participation in the life of the polis, in the life of society. And it also had this connotation of public education. A citizen was expected to maximize the amount of time he spent on skole. But there were 2 other forms of activity that the philosophers regarded as equally important. One was urgia, which literally translated means idleness. Idleness was regarded as an essential use of time because it enabled you to have control of your mind. And later, Cato famously said, "Never is a man more active than when he's doing nothing." And in addition to urgia, we have the beginnings of a key theme that goes throughout my work, and particularly in this book, commoning. Commoning was associated with a Greek concept of eranos, which involved meeting and debating and discussing and feasting, but it was in a social activity that regarded as an essential use of time. Now you go through these concepts, and they're refined during the Roman period, which was distinguished by the Justinian Codex of AD 529-534. And what the Justinian Codex was establishing the base of common law. Every democracy today, with the exception of the country I'm not allowed to just mention, respects commoning and the principles of common law. And the principles went forward, in our case, in Britain, into the struggles, the social struggles that took place around the beginning of the 13th century that led to the monumental constitutional documents that define our society. In November the 6th, 1217, the regent of the 10-year-old king put his seal to the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. These, and particularly the Charter of the Forest, were the most subversive constitutional documents of all time, because they established the right to common, the right to work and to avoid doing labor. We celebrate Robin Hood. We celebrate many of the myths that are associated with Robin Hood, But the constitutional commitment to accept the commons as the fundamental basis of society was dramatic. And for generations afterwards, every church in England had to read out the Charter of the Forest in its entirety 4 times a year. It was only repealed by a Conservative government in 1971. The longest constitutional law in history of any country in the world. And this led forward to an interpretation of our history. Every single rebellion and protest has been about the defense of the right to common, the right to work. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the Kett's Rebellion, the Blacking movement of the 18th century, the Luddites. The Luddites have been misrepresented in history books and by modern people as being against machines. It's not true. What they were against was a destruction of a way of life, a way of living in the commons. And that is, I document in the book. And the struggles for the restoration of the right to work as against the duty to labor went through to the end of the 19th century with the movement of William Morris, the anarchists, and so on. And that leads to the second theme of the book. The second theme is that you can interpret time and our history in terms of 3 time regimes. The first time regime, the early phase, I call the agrarian time regime. Time was cyclical, seasonal. Every village in England tended to have a different time of day. It was determined by the weather. You had vernacular scolae, informal communication. You had a huge number of holy days where people involved in social sharing. And the class struggle was about the right to work and to common. I won't go into the details because I want to get to the modern period quickly. The second phase was the industrial time regime, which began in the 16th century with the attempt by the state, by the Tudors in particular, to forge a new industrial working class when most people still wanted to common and to work. So the most defining thing were the Vagabondage Acts of the 1540s. Any man caught not doing labor, but doing commoning, was branded with a V for the first offense. The second offense, they were hanged. I don't think they could do much commoning after that. Something like 200,000 people were hanged. And it's part of our history that somehow doesn't get repeated. But I give a few details in the book if you can stomach those details. And basically what was going on was a suppression of the guilds, suppression of all activities that were outside labor. And this went on through the 19th century to what I believe is the greatest era of modernity. What I mean by that is that at the end of the century, end of the 19th century, after the defeat of William Morris, the defeat of various other movements, you get universalization of labor. Everybody must be in labor. Everybody must have jobs. The communists wanted everybody to be in labor. The Social Democrats wanted everybody to be in labor. The conservatives of the time, the small c or whatever, are happy to accept that. You know, supplying labor, that's just what they wanted. And then we had a period from the early part of the 20th century when all the political movements were about putting people into labor, and you have a period of industrial time which was epitomized by Frederick Taylor, of Taylorism and Fordism. Taylorism said, basically, and not much more than this, that he wanted all the workers to use their time without thinking. Their job was not to think. That was managers. Managers thought, workers did. And of course it was taken forward in Charlie Chaplin's wonderful film, Modern Times, but Taylorism defined industrial time, blocks of time. You get up in the morning, you go to the factory, you go home, you're tired out, you have a bit of sex if you've still got energy, go to bed. Have a few years of schooling, long years of labor, a couple of years of retirement if you're still able, drop dead. That section of blocks of time was what defined the early decades of the 20th century. But at the same time, leisure was denuded of its radicalism that the Greeks had established. It became a bourgeois concept. Leisure, and the famous book of Veblen, the 1899, said leisure was consumption. It was the vicarious consumption of a bourgeois wife who was expected to use her time to consume and show off and so on. It was a bourgeoisification because it took away the radicalization of time. And it goes on, and I want to make one further point. In 2001, when I'd fallen out with the United Nations because of their acceptance of laborism, the United Nations declared that Frederick Taylor's book of 1911 was the most important management book of the whole century. So that was pretty powerful in terms of establishing a model. Now, the story of my work tries to link up with the work of Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi wrote a wonderful book, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, in 1944 called The Great Transformation. And in that book, and I'm very pleased that his daughter has endorsed my books, and I'm very happy about that. In the book of Polanyi, he said basically this early phase of capitalism would result in finance dominating, and a point would be reached when the inequalities and the insecurities and the compressions that were taking place would result in the threat of the annihilation of civilization. That was the 1930s, fascism, Nazism, Bolshevism, etc. It has a very familiar tune in the country I'm not allowed to mention. So Polanyi's book said that in order for that threat to come, there needed to be a re-embedded phase where society brings in the economic system and reduces the insecurities. So we have a period after the Second World War where labor became something to be turned into decent labor. Everybody should have the benefits of sharing and security in labor. It was a sort of resolution of the crisis, but it resulted in what Hannah Arendt warned was a danger: the job holder society. That everything mattered about your job, making a fetish of jobs. So your job gives you purpose, your job gives you happiness, your job blah, 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 blah. Well, most people who pushed into jobs have a few words to correct that impression. But by the 1970s, this model of industrial time was breaking down. It was breaking down in the time when Thatcher and Reagan became the new leaders of a new economics revolution. And that economics revolution coincides with what I'm calling a tertiary time regime. Suddenly we had a global transformation taking place in which the old industrial time system was breaking down and the boundaries between activities started becoming fuzzy. More and more work was being done in labor, labor was done outside labor time, outside labor workplaces, and so on. And the boundaries between workplaces and home places started to wither. You had a new phenomenon in the world, which I call indirect labor. More and more labor is being done in one country, but supplied to another. The politicians focus all on migration and so on, but actually what has been happening is a huge number, millions and millions of people are supplying labor into this country, but are residing in another part of the world, and every place that's happening. These are new phenomena. But what's happened is a new global class structure has emerged. You have a plutocracy, I think we know which gentleman is at the top of the plutocracy, of ultra-wealthy billionaires. You have an elite serving their interests. You have a salariat, people who still have employment security, pensions, paid holidays, etc. And a shrinking proletariat, a shrinking number of people who had the old model of time. And underneath is the group I've written several books about, the precariat. I wrote a book called The Precariat in 2011. It's been translated into 25 languages and has taken me all over the world. It's every single day I get emails from people who say, I'm part of the precariat. The precariat has three dimensions. The first dimension is that they have unstable, insecure labor. That's the least important part, although commentators and newspaper people always say that's what I'm talking about. It's not. The precariat has to do an enormous amount of work for labor. It has to do an enormous amount of activities for which it doesn't get any compensation. It has a tendency to have to do a lot of training and training and training. It has to do a lot of activities that use up time. And it doesn't have an occupational narrative. If you're in the precariat, you do not know what you're going to be doing in a few months, in a few years. And it's the first mass class in history whose level of education, formal schooling, formal education, is above the level of labor they expect to obtain. Plenty of statistics I've produced on that. And second, it has to rely on money wages and is exploited by debt. Debt is a very key determinant of people's time use. In the ancient times, when debt rose, a wise ruler would introduce debt jubilees, abolish all debt, because debt meant an oligarchy could get control and enslave people's time and be against the interests of society. But debt today dwarfs anything in the past. And the third part of the precariat is that they're losing the rights of citizenship. They're losing social rights, they're losing cultural rights, they're losing political rights and economic rights. They cannot do what they are qualified to do. And they do not see in the political spectrum any political party or movement that represents their interests. The interesting thing about the precariat is that it is not wedded to laborism. If you're in the precariat, the job you're doing today may be completely different from the job you're doing in the future. So you don't develop a false consciousness that it is so important that everything else doesn't matter. In a sense, that's a sense of freedom. But they also means you don't have a loyalty to the mainstream political parties. The Labour Party in this country hasn't got it yet, nor have the Democrats in that country I'm not allowed to mention. They're still appealing to the old proletariat, and they cannot relate to the precariat. And the precariat are repaying them by either staying at home or going elsewhere. Now, the precariat is split by an appreciation of time. The relatively uneducated part of the precariat I call the atavists. They feel that they've lost the past. And the populists, like the leader of that country that I'm not allowed to mention, promise to bring back the past. They promise, we will be great again. And the precariat part is aligning, listening, because nobody else is offering a better suggestion. The second part of the precariat I call the nostalgics. They're the migrants, the ethnic minorities and things. They don't have a present. They don't have a home. So they disengage, except for days of rage when it's too great. And the third group I call the progressives. These are the groups I talk to in many places. These are the people who were sent by their parents and their friends and their communities, go to college and you will have a future. You will have a career. And they come out, they've got debts, they bought a lottery ticket, and they don't have a future. This group is looking for a new politics of paradise, a politics of time, and they're not being offered it. Which leads to the third theme, which I will address briefly because I'm going to run out of time otherwise, which is one of the greatest inequalities we have today, is about control of time. If you're the people that I'm not allowed to mention, but up here, they have control of their time. They may be stupid enough to work 120 hours a week or whatever Musk claims to work, but they have control of their time. The salariat is more interesting. The salariat are those, that minority, and maybe there are some of you in this audience who've been in it or are in it, who have employment security. And they have 6 types of time freedom. The first is they get a lot of paid holidays. A lot of paid holidays. The second is they get future time security because they can look forward to a pension, a decent pension. The third gets less attention. It's called, in my book, bleisure. Business, leisure, put together. It's all about those trips, away days, bonding sessions, vacations that are dressed up as blah, blah, blah. A lot of whiskey and a lot of golf courses seem to be the attractive places for bleisure. I call it the corporatization of phony leisure, because it isn't really leisure, but it's free time. And then there's a fourth, which I think is rather more interesting, called empty labor. Empty labor is a lot of people in the salariat are paid a lot of money for doing nothing. I give an example of a civil servant, and it could have been any country, any type of job. And when he came to his retirement, he sent an email to all his colleagues and said, I've been here for the last 14 years, but I've not really been here because I've had nothing to do. I asked several times, could I have something to do? But because of the rearrangements, I had nothing to do. And in that time, I've been paid huge amount. Well, the emails was leaked, but he didn't lose anything, and he hadn't done anything wrong. And then there's a man I quote in the City of London. He said he was paid a 6-figure sum each year for 6 years as a financial executive. And he said, I could have easily done the work over the 6 years in 6 weeks or maybe at most 6 months. But I suffered bore out, as opposed to burnout, bore out, and nothing to do. And then, of course, there's the paid retraining. If you're in the salariat, you go on endless training courses. It's called, technical name is what's it called? Professional retraining courses, okay? Now, I've got quotations from people who say, look, we all know it's a complete waste of time. It's usually advertising some products that we go there and we do it and we get paid. Very nice, okay? And this pattern of time use, the final time use, is side shuffling. It's a term which McKinsey now says that 5% of all those in salaried employment in rich countries are doing side shuffles. What that means is they have 2 or 3 full-time jobs at the same time and paid for those. That's the reality of our parasitic salariat. And it applies to a lot of people. But by contrast, the precariat has the opposite. Not only does it get none of those things, but it has to do a lot of work for labor off the workplaces, which if they don't do, they're going to pay a heavy price. They have to do a lot of work retraining, learning skills, so that they can go forward with the hope of getting a casual job in the future. So any time that their skills are obsolescent, we have to keep on, have to go retraining, and they pay for it. And then there's work for reproduction, because you see, part of being in the precariat is you must show emotional labor. It's a nice term for being obsequious, smiling. Have a good day, have a good day. So nice to see you again. Such a nice... It's not very dignifying, is it? But we all know that that's the reality if you're chronically insecure. There are also work as waiting around. They have to spend a hell of a lot of time waiting for a casual job, waiting for a task, waiting for some favor that could come along. And then there is the work for the state. I nearly said something rude, but I get very angry, let's put it that way, thinking about how the state has converted social policy into forcing people who are vulnerable, who are sick, who are facing a rough time, to go through the loops to get a modest payment of some sort of benefit. They have to use up a hell of a lot of time and dignity in applying. They have to wait around, they have to queue, they have to fill more forms, they have to fill more CVs or whatever it is, all showing their failure. We punish them with sanctions. Several 100,000 people, our fellow citizens, are sanctioned every year, have their benefits taken away because they were 10 minutes late for an interview, or they missed this, or they got angry. Something. No due process. No respect for Magna Carta. Found guilty as charged by some bureaucrat. This is a terrible experience, and it affects a growing number of people. Huge numbers of people. Then there is work as self-management, dealing with your finances. And the final indignity, I suspect many of you in this room have seen it, is work as seeking charity. We thought this was a Victorian issue, Victorian era issue. But in fact, they have to spend a lot of time seeking charity, being supplicants, the original definition of precarious. So we have a situation where people are suffering from what I've called the 4 A's. A sense of anxiety, a sense of alienation, a sense of anomie, hopelessness, and a sense of anger. That anger today is very, very strong. And this leads to the 4th and final theme, which is that we are living in an age of uncertainty. Now, I'm an economist, and uncertainty means something very, very specific. It means unknown unknowns, polycrises that can hit you at any time, a feeling that we don't have any security and we don't know how to get that security, where shocks could hit us and we don't know how we will cope and how we will recover. During the pandemic, massive attack, contacted me, much to my surprise, and asked me to do a video, musical video, about this and about how it's reducing the sense of robustness, a sense of immunity of people, a sense of resilience, reducing that. So people are on the edge. And we have enormous increase of deaths of despair, of rising mental illness, of suicides among the young. We have a rising incidence of morbidity. And the government is about to say, these people are inactive. We are going to cut disability benefits or whatever it is next to drive them back. But I've talked to quite a few, and I don't think they're unrepresentative of people under stress. Now, uncertainty means you have to have a new way of looking at how we give people security. And this leads to the final chapter. The final chapter, you will be glad to know, I have 5 minutes, I think, is that correct? 5 minutes? The final chapter is an allegorical chapter. Allegorical in the sense that there was a strange business in the mid-2020s, when we had a landslide election victory in this country with a party that only had 19% of support of the electorate. 19%. And it led to a period with directionless inability to listen and respond to the growth of the precariat and respond to this time pressure and the anger out there. And then there was another election, and people's voices changed. And they demanded a different way of looking at time, a politics of time, which was a resurrection of trying to relate to people's freedom, to sense of justice, and a revival of commoning. And the chapter looks at some of the key changes that they brought in. I don't want to ruin your possible interest in buying the book by telling you my scenario. But I believe every single one of the proposals in that chapter are eminently easily introduced and are essential. I'm prepared to put my dwindling reputation on that proposition. But I want to end by returning, and no doubt any of you who were here at my earlier talks will know, where I've spent all my working life on, which is, I believe, that an essential part of the answer to this crisis, and it is a crisis, is the movement towards a basic income for everybody. We can afford it. We can afford it without any problem whatsoever. I've done a calculation. The richest man in the world, currently in that government of the country I shouldn't mention, if you do a calculation and say just on measuring a very low rate of return on his investment from his wealth, okay, and that amount is enough to pay every single American a guaranteed basic income of nearly $100,000 a year. One man. You don't have to take it all from one man. This country has a high ratio of billionaires who are making money because they've made money. They're gaining every time they go to sleep. Don't tell me they've deserved it. But we need to think of moving towards giving everybody basic security. I don't mean total security. I mean just enough to say, tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up And I'm going to be able to stand up and have enough to eat and be able to feed my child and whatever. I'm very privileged to have had the chance to put into practice something I've been advocating for 30, 40 years. We've done basic income pilots in numerous countries. At the moment, there are over 100 basic income pilots taking place. I've just finished being the technical advisor to a basic income pilot in Wales, which was run by Mark Drakeford, Prime Minister of Wales for a long time, who told me that he'd come to one of my talks and he said he was going to do it in Wales. And he's introduced it so every care leaver received a basic income for 2 years, unconditional. You do what you like with it, make something of your life. I'm not allowed to tell you the results because the report hasn't come out yet. I've had to sign secret acts and things, so I'm not allowed to tell you the results. I just want you to look at my face. But we've done pilots in numerous countries, and in everywhere we've done it, nutrition of people improves, mental health improves, physical health improves. Young people spend more time in education and learn more when they're there. People have a sense of doing more work, not less. They're energized, they're given confidence. They have ability to learn skills. And we've seen this in countries like India, in Africa, in South Korea, in Canada, in Finland, and the results I summarize. The point is this. We know we see improvements. Why don't the political people get it? I promise you there are at least 3 members of the front bench of the current government who've told me not once, not twice, not 3 times that they believe in it. They believe in it, and it should be done. But when they get into cabinet office, they become very quiet. You know, I'm very quiet. I must keep my head down. We don't need people like that. I know that we can do it. We have seen it. And the only hope is that enough people are going to become so angry that they will want to realize that unless we move in this direction, more people will be voting for the fascists in that country that I'm not allowed to mention, and in this country and elsewhere. We have to have a sense of the future brought back for the young. We have to have a sense of commoning. Commoning means connecting with nature. Change what we mean by growth. And that leads to my last point, answering that question I posed at the beginning. The work that has more value than any other is unpaid care work. The Office of National Statistics has estimated that the imputed monetary value of unpaid care work, mainly done by women, but not only, is worth more than the whole of manufacturing and the whole of services, except financial services, all put together. And when they castigate economic inactivity, I wrote a little piece in the Financial Times, and I got some incredible insults. I noticed they were all from men. And one man wrote, he said, if you give a value to unpaid care, you might as well give it for breastfeeding. So I went back to him and I said, well, if you read my book, you will see I have done precisely that. Why should economic growth give a value to cow's milk and not to women's milk? Seriously, I'm not being facetious. Why do we not realize that giving care to those we love. Commoning is just as valuable as sitting in a store, in the checkout counter, or in an Amazon warehouse, or cleaning public toilets. It's the most valuable form of work. And we must revive schole, deliberative participation in society. This meeting here is an exercise in schole. And that's why I celebrate Bill and his colleagues, because this is what we need much more of. Because we need to hear and listen and exchange views, instead of having the silos of social media and the influencers and what's going on. Time is a precious asset, and we must fight for it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for getting back so promptly. There are microphones downstairs and upstairs, and I've got quite a lot of questions from you on the table. And by the way, we are allowed to mention the United States of America. I think it was in any questions from the floor. I did just give the aside that we have heard a lot about some of those people, both last week and it's going to happen next week. So I thought you might like a day off. But some of the questions we'll touch on that, and so you can name names. We'll start off with a different name, which is Magna Carta. Okay, because you referred to that early on, Guy, and so don't give your answers to me. Please give them to the audience. I was told that Magna Carta was not important anymore in English law, but central to U.S. law. Hence, the Runnymede Memorial paid for by the United States. Can you comment on that? I've been to the memorial myself, because I used to live in that area.
I'm going to go and stand up.
No, you can sit here if you would like to.
No, I prefer to stand up.
You prefer to stand? Oh, all right.
I get further away from you than that way.
Right.
Magna Carta. Magna Carta began as the Charter of Liberties in June 1215 in Runnymede. But it only became Magna Carta in November 6th, 1217. Now, we were taught at school it was 1215, right? But it only became Magna Carta because part of it was taken away and put in the Charter of the Forest. Now, the Magna Carta defines the rule of law. The rule of law includes due process. That's fundamental phenomenon of all common law, due process. And that you have the right to be represented by an independent person, and you have a right to be judged by independent people. That's not a feature of just American law, it's a feature of every democracy. What we have in this country and in the United States, and why it is moving in a more fascistic direction, is arbitrary, bureaucratic, or state action without any respect for due process. If you are a benefit claimant, and you've got a speech impediment, or you've got a disability, you aren't able to defend yourself very well. That doesn't mean you're guilty. But summarily, they take away people's benefits, which is their livelihoods. It's the difference between survival. One 20-year-old, and I promise this is true, I'm not making it up, one 20-year-old wrote to me and said, look, I had a bicycle. They've taken my bicycle away because they say I owe and I've been claiming benefits, but I tried and I can't get any treatment, and my appeal won't take place till next year. I've appealed. The next thing, a friend wrote and said, he's just committed suicide. Now, you drive people that way and you're not respecting the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a fundamental important document. And the Charter of the Forest was equally important, as I try to show in the books. So for me, it's fundamental. But you're right, whoever asked the question, it is supposed to be the base of the US Constitution and common law and the public trust doctrine in the United States as well. And this man in the Oval Office is not respecting it at all. This man who's just been arrested in the middle of the night and taken away from his university and transported 1,000 miles to a detention center in Louisiana from Columbia University just because he was protesting about the genocide in Gaza. No due process there, mates. So we are in a crisis point, and I do think we should take it seriously. But whoever asked the question, it's fundamental.
I'm going to move on to some questions around productivity and back to work. The two presented slightly differently, Guy. So Chris Nibbs, as time has got fuzzy around boundaries of home and work, has that led to a less productive world? As Julie says, if we're heading towards a time of major change in the use and purpose of time, why are politicians wasting so much time focusing on getting people back to work, reviving production in the home country and so on? So could you talk around that for us?
You see, the language in this question reminds me that I've not been a very good communicator. Because there's not talking about getting back to work. He's talking about getting back to labor, right? And this is not necessarily the same thing. I believe that many of the greatest forms of work are not in jobs. Some of you, many of you, are retired. But I bet you do a lot of things that are counted as work in any sensible definition. If you have an allotment, you are doing work, and you're doing commoning because you're producing with nature, you're linking with nature and your neighbors. This is work. If you take your dog for a walk, if you have a dog, you take a dog for a walk, that's called leisure. If you pay me to take your dog for a walk, I'm adding to GDP. I'm adding to GDP. I mean, what sort of nonsense is that? So we really have to reinvent what we mean by work. That's the challenge. I mean, many of the greatest things we do, we love our neighbors, we love our community, we love our grandmothers and whatever. None of it counts as work. What the flip are we doing? We should mock, and every woman should mock, because it's fundamentally sexist, right? In a most stupid way. So I think that this is so important, but it's a very small point. You don't need to be Einstein to work it out that those activities are work. And more we want to do those things. And that's what's part of the message.
A few years ago, by the way, this is an aside, there was a lecture here by the head of the government statistical service, and he was rather sort of pleased with himself and told the university audience how swimming it all was. So I put in a question, because I knew the answer to it, to embarrass him. I asked him to confirm that the European statisticians had agreed a new measure of GDP that was reorganized to include the activities of drug dealers and prostitutes, so it caused quite a bit of upset, and he had to agree that they just agreed it, but he didn't know how they measured it. So yes, I'm with you on all of that. Now, question on the salariat you've prompted from Mark Dormer. What does he say here? Oh, yes. What sacrifices in income and wealth does the salariat need to make to achieve the outcomes that you are seeking? And I can assume that we have, as you said, some of the members here are current or past members of the salariat.
I think when I was at Cambridge as a student, when we were doing labour economics, we thought that by the end of the 20th century, almost everybody would be in what I'm calling the salariat, with employment security, pensions, paid holidays, paid medical leave, all that stuff, right? It's been shrinking all over the world ever since, and more the salariat is split into people who are going upwards and getting a lot of rental income from property and investments and all of that stuff, and then another lot sinking into becoming more proletarianized and part of the precariat. But when I give a talk, wherever it is, at least one person will come down the aisle and say, I'd like a copy or 2 copies of your book because I want to give them to my son and daughter because they're not going into the salariat. They're not going in that direction. And that, I think, is enabling many of the people in the salariat to have an appreciation of the other, a sense of compassion, which is vital for reviving decency, reviving the sense of isagoria, which I haven't talked about in my talk, but it's in there. The sense that putting yourself in the other's shoes. Neoliberalism in the last 50 years, particularly under Thatcher when she said there's no such thing as society, has focused on individualizing everybody. You're either a success or you're a failure. And we have to rescue a sense of compassion. And that, I think, is so, so important. And I don't hear it in the political leaderships in Westminster. I was an economic advisor for John McDonnell for 3 years, and I mixed with a lot of MPs and so on. And I kept coming away thinking, where have they been brought up? Where there's their sense of compassion? And I think that is so important that we say we must revive it.
Right, we've got to move into sort of, you're quite combative, aren't you, Guy, would you say?
Sorry?
Would you say you are combative?
I would say I'm a sort of indecently combative.
Right, okay. Well, so these aren't necessarily pushback questions, one of them might be. So, Don Muir, if you're allowed to talk about the country, if I'm to mention, talk about the United States, what would you like to say about them? As I said earlier on, we'd love to have your views. Graham Smith, I think, is taking issue. He says, you're right, we ought to talk and exchange more ideas, but do you think we can do so without expressing contempt for people who have different opinions and not label them as fascists? So, which I think was a term that you used once or twice. So you might want to sort of clarify. I put them together because I have a feeling that some of the fascists might be in the United States. Do you want to sort of give us a few definitions?
Well, excuse me for name dropping just for a moment, but in 2016 I got invited by the Bilderberg Group to go and talk to them about the precariat and basic income in a secret rendezvous in Bremen, in a castle. And they were all some of the richest, most powerful men, mostly men, a couple of women, in the world. And for 3 days I sat next to a man called Peter Thiel. Now, Peter Thiel was Trump's fundamental funder in 2016, and he was the man who's promoted Vance. He got Vance to become the vice president. He's funded him altogether. He's his protege. And Peter Thiel has written an article, you can find it easily enough, where he says economic freedom is incompatible with democracy. We want economic freedom. There should not be democracy. Oh, okay. If you look at some of the statements that Donald Trump has made, they are nothing short of fascism. Nothing short of fascism. He talks about the deep state, and we were going to get rid of the swamp. And he talks to the QAnons, these people that believe that the United States is run by pedophiles. And he wants them to support him because he's going to overthrow them, and overthrow them in a violent way. I've got quotations from the man. Hitler couldn't say it better. I'm serious. We've got to realize we're facing a man who is really strongly fascistic. Whether you use another word, I don't care. But it's about time we stood up and said, I'm sorry, we're not going to tolerate this. How is it that 45% of American women who voted for a man who's an open misogynist, who's been convicted of sexual assault, who boasts about grabbing women? What sort of word should I use to describe that man? What sort of word? I'm sorry, but don't ask me to be polite. And that's what we all should do.
Anything else? But I think we should ask you whether you regard this as a purely American phenomenon, or whether you see it more globally.
When I finished this book, I thought I could go and retire and stop. But my publisher has persuaded me to write a sequel. And the sequel's about to come out, but I'm sure you won't be inviting me back, Bill. But I describe what's happened. I describe what's happening as the emergence of the first plutarchy. Plutarchy is an ancient Greek word, essentially translated rule by the super wealthy for the super wealthy. Okay? And this is the first plutarchy. If you take the wealth of the 4 richest men in the world, Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Larry Ellison, their combined wealth as of last month was $1,100 billion. Richest men in history by a street. They are all in the inner circle of Trump. They are now ruling directly. The man I had an argument with, a televised argument on the stage in Davos, Larry Fink, he is the head of BlackRock, which has $11.6 trillion worth of assets under his management. Last week, he phoned up his friend Donald Trump and said, "You want Panama. You said you're going to take back Panama. I can do it for you." And so you will see in the news in the next few days, he has just bought the main ports in Panama for the United States. He's done. Greenland next. The Arctic next. It's an imperialistic project. And we should all be very worried. He's taking the minerals of Ukraine. Where next? He's going to make Gaza into the Trump Gaza. You should all try and see the wonderful video that's been put out, a 33-second video, which shows the carnage in Gaza. I've been working in Palestine last year, so I feel affected by it. The trash and the carnage. And then it flashes to a scene of Trump Tower, Trump hotels, Netanyahu and Trump on the beach sipping drinks. And then it ends with a great golden statue of Trump. Now, what makes that video incredible is that Donald Trump puts it out on his own social media. He thinks it's worthy of doing that. And then the man who made the film has come up and said, hey, I made it as a satire. I made it because it's so stupid. But Trump thinks it was really great. I mean, what sort of person are we dealing with? Sorry. You asked me to elaborate.
Fine.
I'll shut up now.
But it sounds like you don't see these tendencies in other parts of the globe.
I think his friends in this country, we know names and we know people. Boris Johnson loves him. Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be dropping names because this is impolite. But I happened to be asked to speak at a big, big, glamorous conference in Delhi. And there was one other foreign speaker. And his name was Boris Johnson. And they put the two of us in the VIP lounge for the whole morning while our session was in the afternoon. So I got into arguing with Boris Johnson. Anyhow, he managed to tell me more lies in 2 hours than I thought it was possible. And when I talked to him about Trump, he went all gooey. Went all gooey. So we had to have our official photograph taken. I had mine done in the corner with all the lights and everything. And then I went down and sat back at the coffee table while Boris went off for his picture to be taken in the corner. And in that moment, the compere, a very famous Indian journalist, came up to the coffee table and said, Dr. Stanning, what question should I ask him? So I said, well, ask him. This was 2019, by the way. I said, ask him if he thinks he's going to become Prime Minister. Oh, it's a good question. Good question. Anything else? Well, so I said, ask him if he has any regrets about standing in front of a bus and saying that if we leave the European Union, it will save £350 million a week on the NHS. He said, how much? I was thinking, you should know these things, right? Anyhow, I said, and at that point, Boris came back, and he said, Guy, let me tell you something. I heard. He said, I have less chance of becoming British Prime Minister than Narendra Modi, Indian Prime Minister. I turned to him, I said, Boris, you won't be surprised, I'm rather pleased to hear that. And then he said, as for that other thing, I never said it. I said, what? I never said it. I said, I know you said it. He said, I never said it. I said, I thought of Jesus and Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane, 3 denials. And then he said, I never said, I said, I've got my computer here. It will take me a minute, open it up, look Google, and I will find it. He said, no. The poor journalist was sitting there going, what's going on? Anyhow, so I opened my computer. It took me 30 seconds. You just put up Johnson, 350 million. Up comes the video showing him in front of the bus. And I'm sure you all remember this scene. Do you know what he said? That's just politics. Now, when you have people who totally disrespect truth, you have an immorality that can go in any sort of direction because they will not have any respect for you, me, you. They are purely transactional, as this Trump is showing. And of course, Boris Johnson rushes across to the inauguration. He laps it up. We need a refreshment of paideia, the search for truth, the respect for truth. And that is part of the Cholet that I'm talking about in the books. We need to rescue commoning. We need to rescue deliberative democracy so that we have a more shared culture, so that we can hear each other's points of view. Call me a fool, and I can call you a fool, or whatever, but at least have the dialogue. And that is so important, and we're lacking it at the moment. I think it's a crisis, an existential crisis.
Thank you for that, and you had a bit of fun there, and I'm going to give you some tough questions about UBI now, as your reward. There's quite a lot
Can
here.
I go now?
These are all meat and drink, given that you are the world's authority on this subject. But let's start. Paul Scott just wants you to check your maths, not on the side of a bus. UBI, $100,000 a year. He was querying that. He's quite analytical, this Paul. So he says 400 billion divided by 200 million US adults is $2,000 a year, not 100,000. Do you want to comment on that?
That 100,000 relates to the employed labor force. Basically, the figure that is in my new book, it relates to his wealth. And Adam Smith, the famous father of modern economics, said you can measure a man's wealth by how many people on average wages his income can pay for. And the figure there is that the richest man in history is Elon Musk by a long, long, long way, and he could pay for 200 million Americans on the average wage that exists in the United States. And I think that is a correct thing. But of course, wealth of these people fluctuates a lot. His wealth rose by he and several others rose by 84 billion in one day. One day after Trump was elected. And the exact figure varies because the figures vary, but what I'm getting at is you can pay an enormous amount in basic income from taxing wealth and what I call eco-fiscal policy, taxing from the commons. We need, for example, a carbon tax. Okay, we need a carbon tax, because otherwise we're not going to get to net zero, never. We need a carbon tax. The trouble with the carbon tax is that a poor person is paying more than a rich person relative to their income. So you have to guarantee to recycle the income from a carbon tax. And I explained setting up a capital fund, how to do it. And what worries me slightly is that Trump, in his way, has stumbled on this, because he's going to set up a sovereign wealth fund in the United States. A sovereign wealth fund which could very quickly build up and have the necessary return to be able to hand out a bread and circus things to the losers. I'm slightly worried by that, because for me, this would be a right-wing way of dealing with it. It has to be embedded, this movement towards a basic income, in a strategy of empowering people and gaining better democracy and so on. And it's not a standalone, but whereas the right may use it to distribute. And that's worrying me at the moment. But we could set up a commons fund, easily do it. One of the crimes of the last century was when they gave away North Sea oil to the oil companies. If they'd done what Norway did, Norway now has easily the biggest in Europe, wealth fund, a capital fund, where it means in effect that every Norwegian is a millionaire, because they kept the royalties, built it up, invested, and now it's a huge fund worth a phenomenal amount. It's not beyond the capacities, and it's not some utopian thing that's up here, science fiction stuff. These are practical things that can be done.
More questions on UBI. So these are basics. If we just sort of quickly deal with them. David Vincent and Adrian Cartwright. So who sets the subsistence level, and on what basis? How much should the universal salary be? How should it be funded? Would it be brought in gradually? And what ill effects does it have?
It's a very big question, which I've tried to address in the books. I won't be able to handle all these in the answer I'm about to give. What is most important, in my view, is to be on the road to a different system. To be on the road away from a punitive, means-tested, behavior-tested form of social policy, to establishing economic rights for people. The level that is an ideal, I don't know that. None of us can know it. The important thing is to build from a start. As you build up the funds that pay it, you can raise the level. What we've found in our numerous experiments is that up to a certain level that we've been paying out, up to say £1,000 a month, it has all those positive effects. Whether it would start having negative effects if it went up to £2,000, I don't know, right? But you could have a system whereby you have an independent, just as you have with independent monetary policy, okay? A group of experts, supposedly, who determine interest rates and policy according to what they think the economy should have. You could have an independent committee determining changes in the level of the basic income and gradually increase it from a small level. If you are a low-wage person in the precariat, say a woman with a small child or 2 children, and you get an extra £100 a week, that makes a big difference. For many people, £100 a week, well, that's not basic income, is it? Okay? But if you are talking about giving people a floor, an anchor, it all counts. And if you know you're moving in the direction, when we can afford it, we'll raise it to £200. Then you start giving people a dignity and a sense of belonging in a community, a feeling that this is economic justice. And it enhances freedom. This is the most important thing. If you give a woman basic income, as we've seen, that is enormously empowering. And I can tell you that we've experienced things where women have said, before I had to sell myself. Now I have some dignity, I have my basic income, I can look after myself better. Those are basics, but basic income does it. It gives people a sense of freedom. It gives people a sense of, I belong. And all I can say is that I've seen this in so many places now, and I just want everybody to be able to see that, because you see people who've suddenly got a little dignity. They buy better clothes. They buy better food for their children. They pay down their debts. Or they may spend the money on buying toys for their children. Okay. And then some politicians say, see, they're wasting their money. Well, flip off. That's how they choose. And for me, this is freedom. We're in the 21st century, damn it. We should be able to afford that every one of our citizens has some basic dignity. Please.
Richard Moulton actually had a question along those lines, but his question is, how do you feel about universal basic income, where some of the people might actually not spend it on looking after their kids, but spend it on cocaine or booze, and they have no money left? I presume that question comes up quite often. Do you just accept that as part of the deal?
No, I don't actually, because we have a number of pilots which have been giving money to ex-convicts, and they've been told, you know, you've paid your price, you've been in prison, now make something of your life. And you do get some recidivism. I'm not going to be saying that they don't, but in the main, people want to make their life. Don't just rely on my statements, because what we found is that when you gave basic income to people, they started spending less on private bads, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, and so on. And the World Bank did a study. The World Bank did a study of all the schemes of giving cash to people. And they found the same thing. They found that actually it was going down. When we launched a scheme in India, Sonia Gandhi, who was Prime Minister at the time, she called us to our house and said, look, we're all going to waste it on tobacco and alcohol. We said, we don't think so, because people want to improve their lives. And after we did the pilot with 12,000 people, she asked us back, and she said, I wish I'd known, because she was about to lose the election to Modi. We said, look, people want to improve their lives. Just because they're poor doesn't mean they're stupid. Yes, there will be some who misuse it. Well, I'm not the winner, but the real importance is that you give people a chance. And most people, believe it or not, are humans. And they want to improve the lives of their children, themselves, their neighbors. We should have more faith in people.
Just to sort of be specific, John Sherwood's got a sort of a tough question on this. And we've noted all these pilots that you mentioned around the world. He's wondering whether you found any government that's been brave enough to take these ideals into a strategic plan so that it becomes embedded. Or are these just pilots that have had a sort of a short lifespan?
No, the interesting thing is whenever there's a new momentum, new social policy, everybody says, or the critics say they'll fail, they'll have all these negative effects. And then subsequently, when they've been introduced, they suddenly say, well, of course. Now, I want to give you a little story, because a man came to one of our congresses in Seoul in 2016. We had hundreds of people, and he came up and he said, Dr. Stanning, please explain, what do you mean by basic income? Individual, no conditions? No. I said, he said, I'm going to stand to become governor in my province, and I'm going to say I'm going to introduce a basic income. I said, well, all right, good luck. He went away. The next time we happened to have our Congress in Hyderabad, in India. A whole lot of people came. And this time he came with an entourage. And he came in and said, Dr. Stanning, I'm now governor of my province. I've introduced a basic income. All the young people aged 16 to 25 now receive a basic income in his big province. I said, that's fantastic. I knew that. Because he asked me to write articles. He said, now, I'm going to stand for president. Okay, all right. President of Korea. He said, okay. I said, well, good luck. He said, would you write some articles? I did. Anyhow, then in 2022, we happened to have our Congress in Seoul again, and he came. And there were thousands of people, young people, came. It was fantastic. And he came to the front, and he stood there and he said, I've failed. So I put my hand up, and I asked to go to the rostrum, and the chair said, yes. So I stood there and I said, you didn't fail? You got 49.5% of the vote. 49.5% on a basic income platform. I said, you didn't fail. A politician going from nothing to getting that, most politicians would give an arm and a leg for that. And I said, you will win next time. Today, his party is streets ahead in the opinion polls. In fact, they've asked me to speak in the parliament. I have done. I can, the energy. Now, it's happening, I think, a lot of places where now people are not saying it's a crazy idea, it's not stupid, it's essential. Because if we're going to stop people voting for far-right populists, whatever you want to call them, then we must overcome the fears of people. Give people a sense of hope, belonging. Because if we don't, we're going to see the same thing as happened in the 1930s. We're seeing that. We can see it. Some of you who are older than I am will know the dangers we face. But you've got to offer people hope. And at the moment, our politicians are not doing that. They're not. They're about to count disability payment. They can't pay for a third child. So every child who's in a family of 3 or 4 children is suffering because it's split less. What sort of country are we do this? So for me, it's a matter of reorienting our thinking. It's not Einstein. It's getting people to have not just hope, but courage. And that's where we are today.
If you have the microphone, thank you for your patience. We're going to take a question downstairs and then upstairs. So, 4th row in front of me.
Hi. Hello. You may just have answered the question, but anyway, given that you've got some traction, you've got some data, the data works, you've got policies, philosophies, ideas. In order to get significant traction, you need education. My question is, where does that start? The home, the school, the commons?
It's a great question, and I didn't pay him to ask the question, because that is precisely the question I posed in the new book. I posed the question, the education industry is partly responsible for where we are today. It stopped teaching about our history, our culture, our philosophy, about compassion. It's all about making money, having more human capital. If you teach people that that's what education is about, don't expect people to come out of school and university with values of culture and art and creativity. So we have to realize that we need a reform of our education system. You know? The number of people who can't read deeply has gone up and up and up. The number of children leaving school who are functionally illiterate is growing up. The number of indicators of a crisis in our school and education system is enormous. I've been a professor in 3 universities. And you won't believe this because I didn't believe it, but I did a calculation the other day. I've given talks in over 150 universities. And in every university I've been to, the professors and the academics and the researchers are telling a similar story. More and more of our students don't know the basics. More and more of our students don't know about our culture. Huge number of students from universities in various countries come out not knowing that the Holocaust happened. Right? What is wrong with our education system that sort of thing is coming out? So we need to put the whole thing together. And at the moment, we're teaching to the test. We suffer from examinitis. Examinitis. We from age 3 all the way up to age 93, in some countries, they've got it in Japan, people are being subject to tests where you fail or you succeed, and if you succeed, you go on to the next test, and to the next test, and the next test. We're teaching to the test, whereas education should be about expanding our imagination, our appreciation, our depth. And it is a genuine crisis as well. Because I can't understand how so many educated people would vote for populist far-right people who have no sense of compassion. How do you explain it? How do you explain it? So I think that's a good question because to me it goes to the heart of the matter.
There's no test to be a member of, if you're a member of Keele World Affairs.
Well, that's right.
And there's no basic income. We don't pay them to come.
So
you'll be pleased they've come to hear you. We've got a question upstairs above the screen, 2nd row.
In your talk, you reminded me of a shocking film I saw several years ago. Name evades me, I'm sad to say, but the phrase that the example you used was a guy who lost his bike or whatever and then committed suicide. And it was related to a Geordie who was a joiner who didn't know what a PC was or what a CV was. And they used the word sanctioned in the film. I was hoping that that word wasn't used again, but you've used it again tonight. And it begs the question, is that word introduced by quangos that are doing work on behalf of governments, or is it as a direct result of government policy?
Well, I mean, it's the word used by the Department of Work and Pensions. It's the word used in universal credit. If you do not do what they tell you to do, you can be sanctioned. That's the word, okay? Now, I think there are several people in the audience who have practical experience with the citizens' advice and other movements dealing with claimants, or what they like to call customers. And a huge number are denied benefits, and then they're allowed to appeal. Now, you punish them first, and then they are allowed to appeal. Well, in most common law systems, you get the appeal before you get the punishment, right? But in this case, the sanction comes first, and then they are allowed to appeal. And as I show, and I'm not alone in this, a lot of people who would subscribe to it, it takes about a year to go from the point where you appeal to the punishment and the appeal being heard. Okay? And it turns out that about 90% of those who appeal win their case. Okay? But after a year of suffering, what's happened to their health? What's happened to their family relationships? What's happened to their dignity? What's happened to their lives? Okay? Now, this is obvious. It's not really being very clever. If you have a system that is designed to punish, that's what happens. Now, I know quite a few people who are in the system in different ways. So I get fed a lot of shocking information. Shocking information. Many of the people dealing with the claimants are fresh out of school or fresh out of college or whatever, had no experience in the world, and are dealing with it. And often these people who are vulnerable and suffering out there, surprise, surprise, they get angry. And then they lose their benefits because they get angry. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not surprising. I would get angry too. If you don't get angry, you're not human. So for me, this is a matter of really standing up and protesting. Now, when I was working with these MPs, they all told me they get it. But as I said in my speech, when they become cabinet ministers, somehow they just lose their voice. They just lose their voice. What's wrong with them? I'm sorry, but I have contempt for some of them.
We have a lot of questions that we can't touch on tonight because we've run out of time. But I'd like to finish with one guy, and it's sort of looking ahead, and that's from Jane. So, what careers advice would you give to a young person? There are a few in the audience.
I would say embrace the precariat. I would say do not be ashamed. I've given a number of talks where somebody has stood up and said, I am part of the precariat, but I'm proud to be part of the precariat because I realize my condition is not unique. I'm not a failure. It's a system that's creating millions of people in this situation, and I'm not going to tell you that everything is important about my job. Instrumentally, I've got to do a job. I need the money. But don't tell me I must be happy in my job. A sense of liberation, but being in control psychologically is what a young person needs. Because a young person must have hope and must be building a future. And too many of them are denied that. And that's what should change. And I believe that it can change. And I really hope that in the next few years, we've got this political imperative to change it. Because if we don't, we're in deep, deep trouble.
So many questions unanswered. We'll have to meet this gentleman again. It's a great joy for me whenever I invite Guy Standing to talk to us, because I do know that each time he will challenge us, he'll open up our thinking, and he'll make us think about the world in a different way. There was one question. I don't think it was a question, actually. It was a recommendation from Phil. He said, start your own party. So we'll watch this space. But for the moment, I hope you will join me in giving a great vote of thanks to our wonderful guest, Guy Standing.
Thank you.